Let's talk about this Alabama decision. And before we get to the politics, some say that the decision violates state and federal laws. It could be vulnerable to legal challenges. But at the same time, as surprised as we are, should we be? People have been concerned that the future of IVF has been at risk since Amy Coney Barrett joined the court.
Well, that's right. Before Amy Coney Barrett became a judge, she publicly supported a group that allowed that in vitro fertilization, IVF, could become criminalized. And here's how that works legally, Steph. Once the Dobbs decision is handed down and every state is free to set its own rules around abortion, states like Alabama adopted fetal personhood bills that said that life began at the moment of conception. Well, the embryos that are used in IVF are post-fertilization. They're post-conception. They're fertilized, they're permitted to grow for a few days, and then they're frozen for future use. So you can see how this works. In states that have fetal personhood, life begins at conception laws, then anything that's done to one of these embryos could possibly carry not just civil consequences, which is what's at stake in the case the Alabama Supreme Court just decided, but they could also carry criminal consequences. So that's the setup here.
Carol, this Supreme Court decision in Alabama, how risky is this for Republicans in an election year?
Look, here's this dynamic. The Republicans were already struggling with how to message on abortion. And now
they're going further.
And now they have this. And you've seen from various prominent Republicans, from Senator Tuberville of Alabama, who didn't really seem to understand what the ruling meant. And
he called it a bill.
Correct. And, you know, to Nikki Haley, to Tim Scott, who said he hasn't really studied the issue, and to former President Trump, who as of yet hasn't weighed in unless he has in the last few moments. And so this is a different dynamic for the polling reasons that you highlighted at the beginning of this, where even if those who are opposed abortion rights are for IVF treatments, it's how people get and grow their families. And then you see the Biden campaign, which is seizing all over this, from the White House to the campaign, and they intend to continue to do that. And the president and the vice president today just drawing this direct line, saying that this decision in Alabama is what they have been warning about after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, and they draw a direct line to former President Trump, saying it's his fault.
Peter, it is worth pointing out just how fringe this Alabama embryo decision is. Mike Pence of all people, we all know him as an outspoken opponent of abortion rights. He has talked in the past about how crucial IVF treatments were for his own family. He has said in the past that fertility treatments, quote, deserve the protection of the law. This is coming from Mike Pence. So what do Republicans say to their voters, many of whom approve of IVF? Many of those voters have families because of IVF.
Yeah, many Republican voters, if not most Republican voters, make a distinction between IVF and abortion. I mean, I think that they see the embryo created outside of the womb is different than an embryo created inside the womb as to whether or not that's a life that needs to be protected under the law. They see the creation of IVF, most Republicans as well as most Democrats, as the creation of life rather than the other way around, helping couples that aren't able to have babies in any other circumstance to have a baby, which is, of course, you know, the goal in some ways of the pro-life movement. So it is an extreme version of the logic of the pro-life movement that has, I think, upset and disturbed a lot of people who otherwise consider themselves to be pretty staunch pro-life advocates, to be, say, anti-abortion advocates. And I think that this is a place where the Republican Party is left to try to explain where it stands. And I don't think you've seen any kind of consensus there. The clips you showed show how unsettled this is for a lot of elected officials trying to straddle the line between the very strong fringe of their party and the mainstream of their party, which, even if it might be against abortion, isn't against IVF.
Joyce, what does this Alabama decision tell us about what else we could see from the courts after Dobbs? What could be next?
Right. I mean, what couldn't be next? Because there's always been a concern that birth control could be one of the next frontiers of attacks. It depends on how far conservatives are willing to push their agenda. And so, to Peter's point, something very interesting is happening in Alabama today, there was a rush to put bills in play in both the Alabama House and the Alabama Senate that would roll this decision back. Bills that would say precisely the theory that Peter laid out, that it's not life unless it's inside of a uterus. So I think that we'll see this sort of practical political impact where Republicans know that Dobbs has been very damaging, not necessarily in the core of their electorate, but among others and certainly among women. And they won't want to go too far with this. I think that makes it unlikely that we'll see, for instance, a direct attack on birth control before the elections. But after that, maybe all bets are off.